This is our fifth exhibition, and for those of us who are joining, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are a public institution for research-based engagement. Today, we will be listening to Geoffrey Reaume. His lecture is called Mad People's History. Geoffrey is Associate Professor in Critical Disability Studies at York University in Toronto, Canada. He earned his PhD in history at the University of Toronto, and his work was published as a book, Remembrance of Patients Past, Patient Life at the Toronto Hospital for the Insane. His study was made into a play performed by psychiatric survivors in Toronto from 1998 to 2000. Reaume is co-editor with Brenda Lefrancois and Robert Menzies of Mad Matters, a critical reader in, a critical reader in Canadian Mad Studies. He created the first university credit course in Mad People's History, which he has been teaching since the year 2000. Do come along for our upcoming programs. We have an event with the director of the museum, Dr. Ghislaine, who will be speaking about From Asylum to Museum Monument on the 30th of April. And we will also hear from him in a lecture on the 30th in the evening, which is called Towards a Museum in Psychiatry. Do remember that you can type in your questions in the Q&A box, and we would of course love to have your feedback when you're ready with it. And in the meanwhile, over to you, Geoffrey. We look forward to what you have to share with us this evening.
Well, thank you, Janavi, and thank you to everyone for inviting me at Science Gallery at Bengaluru. I'm very happy to be here and be glad to hear any comments people might have. So I'm going to show my my slides now, and I'll just start from the beginning here so you can see them better. Whoops, just move this out of the way and put that over there. Okay, so I'll be talking about Mad People's History today. This topic rather has been developed over many years to discuss the history of madness from the points of view or perspectives of people who've been deemed mad, mentally ill, psychiatric disability, or whatever term one uses. There's of course huge differences in the terms that we use for madness over different times. I've chosen this term, madness, because it's the one that's most historically accurate over the longest period of time. The term mental illness is a term that has only been around for a little more than 100 years now. So when I talk about ancient people or even people a couple of hundred years ago, it wouldn't really apply. It doesn't, it wouldn't be a term they would recognize. It's also a very contested term. Mental illnesses, madnesses, all these terms are. So we need to acknowledge the differences in interpretations in this regard. So I'm going to go back to all the way to probably one of the first people who's acknowledged as having been a mad person in history, and that was Nebuchadnezzar, the king of ancient Babylon, in the Christian Old Testament or in the Jewish Bible. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, was said to, he proclaimed himself as greater than God. God struck him down for 7 years and he crawled on all fours like an animal. And then after he repented, God restored him to his throne and he was restored to reason. The reason I bring this up is not only is he one of the first, if not the first person named in history as a mad person, but it's an image of madness as badness, a very negative image of madness as animalistic, something that is a curse that's come down through history. There are other images as well, but this is one of the most enduring and unfortunate, to say the least, images of madness throughout history and has had very negative repercussions. This book I took as a picture from a book for children called The Hospital, and you can see these caricatures of mad people looking very wild and with vacant looks. That's very problematic. So I'm trying to teach this course to show the different experiences that people deemed mad have had over the years and how people are are human, are not animals, and that's very important to emphasize. And there's been these stereotypes for thousands of years. This is a good example from medieval Europe. You can see the devil is in the moon, impacting these different women experiences of madness. And of course, many women were particularly deemed madness. A lot of it was due to male attitudes towards women's reproductive abilities, where hysteria and other terms were developed specifically to categorize women's experiences of mental health distress, but it was also very much used to claim in medieval periods that women, in some cases, were possessed by the devil. And so they're very much of a supernatural image that comes up. And so again, madness as badness, and madness is something that is to be feared. Mad women were also, and mad people generally were also restrained at different times. This picture is of a woman named Margaret. Her actual, she was an actual person who lived in 1520 Germany, 500 years ago in Bavaria, to be specific. And you can see it, and on her ankle, she's chained to the wall. She was brought by her family to the prayer chapel, and in the right-hand corner, you can see a person who was praying for her. So this was the sort of treatment that some mad people who were in this case in the upper class, her father was a burgermeister, the equivalent of a mayor in Bavaria at that time, were prayed over, and in this case was chained. So it was a pretty grim history of mad people's existence. Most people during this period in experiencing madness in these different parts of the world, in this case in Western Europe, lived in the community, but there were some who were restrained. We also have ships of fools, metaphors of mad people being cast out. You had a video, which I watched the other night, that is on the website about Foucault's interpretations of the history of madness, which have been hotly debated, and that includes ships of fools, the idea that mad people were cast out on boats to wander around the ports of Europe. Historians have very much doubted that these ships actually existed. It's more of a metaphor than of actual, real, actual history of having taken place. But there's no doubt mad people were certainly ostracized during this period. Now, this is an early example of a mad person's actual writings of their history. And this is by Hannah Allen. She's the first person who wrote of her own experience of madness while mad in 1683 in English. It's also very unusual because it's also writing by a woman, and most of the early writings of madness are by men, because of course the very small group of people could actually read and write during this period, and most of those were upper class men. There were some well-to-do women like Hannah Allen who could read and write, but most were men. So we have some early histories of madness, and Hannah Allen had a lot of psychological depression during this period, and she wrote about what her experiences were, and self-harm as well. So it's a very early example of it. Of course, there's a long history of mad people being placed on display, perhaps the most notorious example being Bedlam, or Bethlehem Bethlehem Hospital in London, England. This is a famous depiction by Hogarth, in which the person who's deemed mad is in the center of the picture. He's literally being watched by different people. He's being brought in there by Sarah, the woman who loves him, but the attendants are unchaining him, and you can see in the background two well-dressed women. They're not mad people. They're people who paid to come in and view mad people. So there was a long history of mad people being viewed as exhibits. That was largely ended by the mid to late 19th century, but it's a long and very disgraceful history of the sort of voyeurism of mad people. Alexander Cruden was one of the first mad people who fought for the rights of madness. Now, I have to emphasize, Cruden very much stressed he was not mad. He was a person who insisted that he was being locked in a madhouse in London, England in 1739 because certain individuals wanted his property. He was released after a period of about 9 months, and he went on to fight for the rights of mad people and prisoners, although he always claimed he was not mad. Nevertheless, he was certainly treated as a mad person, so that's where he's included in this history. He's also been portrayed as very negatively. As you can see, this image, he's racialized, so there's a racist aspect to the way he's portrayed with his skin darker, which is part of the racist history, of course, of portraying people negatively in European and North American contexts. But he did a lot of very important work on behalf of mad people and prisoners during this period when very few people were willing to do. And he was from the very high upper class in the Anglican elite and was pretty well ostracized as a result. This is the publication of his 1739 publication protesting the abuse of mad people in madhouses. And so when you read this account that he wrote, and you realize he was from the high upper class, one only has to wonder what it was like for the poorest of the poor. And this was a period, of course, when more madhouses were being established. This is by Samuel Bruckshaw, 1774, his accounts of madness and experiences of abuses which he experienced. But these are examples of writings by people who were from the elite at this time. William Belcher's 1796 account of his abuse in madhouses during this time as well in England. He too was quite well to do. He was confined for a total of 17 years. But the point I'm trying to emphasize is that these early accounts tended to be unrepresentative in the sense that they were from rich and well-to-do mad people. The vast majority of people who were deemed mad would have been poor, illiterate people whose points of views we will never know because they left no accounts. They couldn't write, and they were just struggling to survive. They didn't have the leisure time to even spend writing a lot of these accounts. So most of the accounts of most people who were mad during this period we won't know because they were not recorded. Perhaps the most famous account of madness during the 18th century was Pinel unchaining the mad people in 1792, 1793 Paris. And this is a famous portrait made almost 100 years later in France. But the reality was that mad people continued to be restrained in different places. This is a restraining chair. So for all the talk about non-restraint during this period, that was begun in France and England as well, in the late 18th and early 19th century, there were continued to be restraints used on people deemed mad in different parts of the world. And so mad people continued to be viewed as animalistic and very negative perceptions during this period. And there continued to be very strong criticisms of these experiences by people who experienced it themselves. This is an account by John Percival. Again, it was written about his account from 1830 to 32, a very early example. And again, he was from the very high upper class. His father, Spencer Percival, was the British Prime Minister. In fact, he was the last British Prime Minister to be assassinated. He was killed his father was killed by an assassin in 1812, but it gives you an idea of how upper class he was. If you're going to be the son of the British Prime Minister in the 19th century, you're from the very highest ranking strata of English society. And so when you read this account and the horrible way in which he was treated, it just gives you an idea of how much worse it must have been for poor mad people who had no one to appeal to. Percival and some others did found the first mad people's organization to fight for their rights called the Alleged Lunatics Friends Society, which lasted from 1845 to 1863 in England. And they advocated for the rights of people at a time when, of patients, asylum inmates, at a time when that was almost unheard of, and particularly fought for the rights of poor patients who were generally unacknowledged during this period. So there were efforts to try to address these issues from the points of view of asylum inmates. And that's important to emphasize because it was during the 19th century that large-scale asylums kept being established in different parts of the world, and particularly in North America and Europe, but also in other parts of the world, including in India. Asylums started being created, and very much so, and replacing the old madhouses. And these were asylums that were based on public funding during this period, state asylums. And so as increasing urbanization developed, there were large-scale institutions like this one in Utica, New York, that developed huge institutions. In many cases, such as the one that was opened here in Toronto in 1850, they were the biggest buildings of their kind in the entire area. The asylum that was opened in Toronto was the biggest building in all of what was then called Canada West, or what we now call Ontario. These were huge institutions. This was also St. Elizabeth's institution in Washington, D.C. The plans for it was made in 1855. And it's also important to emphasize, of course, the long history of racism and madness in this history. If you look at the bottom of the drawing, you can see an outline of buildings. But further up around the middle of the page on both sides, there is small buildings in the back, towards the back of the drawing. And those are for people who were African Americans. One of the buildings says lodge for colored women, and the other says lodge for colored men, and that meant African American men and women. And they were segregated from the white asylum inmates in Washington, D.C., and kept in the worst conditions of all institutional inmates. So a long history of racism towards asylum inmates during this period that needs to be emphasized. And that's very important to underline, particularly in different parts of the world. In the case of the United States, there was a long history of African Americans being segregated in institutions at different times in different places, up to the mid-20th century in the southern United States. And in India, of course, there were institutions that were created beginning in the 19th century first for only European asylum inmates, and then for Indians as well, but they were segregated. Indian population was segregated in different institutions and were confined in the worst institutions as well, very poorly run. And there's even reports of a particular institution in Delhi where the doctor in the 1850s starved the patients to death if they did not work. Dr. Patton was recorded as having starved patients to death in a Delhi asylum if they didn't do labor. So there is a long history as well of exploitation of inmates' labor in different parts of the world, including in colonial India. And there's also a long history too of segregation of racialized patients who were not white in Canada as well as in the US. And there were Chinese patients were, for example, segregated in British Columbia insane asylums in Canada into the late 19th century. When they were integrated in the 20th century, they were given the worst jobs, and although many of them were earmarked for deportation. In 1935, 65 Chinese male patients some of whom had been in Canada for decades, most of whom had been and who had been in Canada for an average of at least 13 years, some for much longer, were deported back to China. And that same year, there was 6 or 7 patients who had been originally from India, who were in British Columbia asylums, were deported back to India as well. So long history of racism and the way in which asylum inmates were treated in different parts of the world, and by the colonial officials in India as one example, and by officials here in North America as another example, both for people who were born in our countries, in Canada and the United States, such as African Americans and African Canadians, as well as Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples in Canada and the United States have a long history of having been treated through a very racist ill treatment and having their beliefs and spiritual beliefs pathologized. And there was even an insane asylum established in Canton, South Dakota from 1903 to 1934 for Aboriginal inmates in the United States, which was notorious for abuse and horrific conditions. That was been shut down. It's one of the readings that we had for today's class as well, or today's lecture as well. Long history of these terrible conditions for patients who were racialized, whether they're from Asia or people who were born here in North America, and many who were also deported who were immigrants to Canada or the United States. So that needs to be very much emphasized in our history. There is also a writing of different asylum inmates. The Opal was an example of a publication written by asylum inmates in institution in New York, in Utica, New York. And so this is some of the issues around race and colonialism that I was mentioning a moment ago, around colonial rulers establishing asylums in India for Europeans and institutions, and Indian asylum inmates' labor being exploited, and in some cases being starved to death in 1850s at Delhi asylum by a British doctor, and some of the examples I mentioned of madness and race in North America as well, and segregation and the horrible treatment of Aboriginal Americans and Canadians were endured, as well as the discrimination towards East Asians and South Asians in Canadian asylums during this period. And so there are lots of different examples of people writing about this abusive treatment. Now, most of the writings from this period that I'm talking about were tended to be from white, upper and middle class inmates, largely because they were the ones who had the privilege and class background to write. There was not mass literacy education in Canada until beginning in the late 19th century, and in same with the United States. So those people who tended to write these accounts tended to be from the upper middle class, and tended to be white people. Perhaps the most famous was Elizabeth Packard. She lived from 1816 to 1897. She was from the United States. She was taken to the asylum by her husband in Illinois. And she very much denounced what was happening to her. She was taken to the asylum by her husband in 1860, and with the collusion of the doctor, she disagreed with her husband about how they were raising their children. He was in favor of corporal punishment. She was opposed, and she was also opposed to slavery, which of course was the #1 issue in the United States in 1860, as we all know, on the eve of this American Civil War, and her husband was in favor of slavery, so he had her confined. She was confined for 3 years, but she was released later, and then she the rest of her life, she worked to try to fight for the rights of asylum inmates, and especially to try to prevent women from being locked up in asylums just on their husbands' say-so. Very important figure in our history. This was at the institution in Toronto, which was opened in 1850. This picture was taken in 1868. Much of these facilities were built by patients, and these are some of the letters that were written. This is a letter from Ralph to my very dear wife. It was written in 1910, and it gives you an idea of the terrible experiences of even those patients who could write. By this time, there was mass literacy. Ralph was a patient. He was a farmer, and he wrote this letter to his wife around 1910. I found it in his file in the 1990s, long after he had died. He died in 1911. And I realized I was reading a letter to this man's wife that his own wife did not get the chance to read. Why? Because it was confiscated. So even if you did have the ability to write and also the money to write, because we also have to remember paper cost more money 112 years ago when this letter was being written. It wasn't as easily available as it is today. And so if you're able to even write a letter as an asylum inmate, they were read by staff, and if the staff did not like it, they were confiscated. So the stress and the torment of writing a letter to a loved one and realizing that it was never even mailed must have been unendurable, and to not get any response, in this case to my very dear wife, from Ralph to his wife, just shortly before he died. And it was very common throughout asylums, throughout the various parts of the world, that if you were an asylum inmate, you had no right of correspondence. you had absolutely no right to write a letter without the staff reading it and deciding whether or not it should be mailed. And this is another example of a confiscated letter written by a woman named Henrietta in 1916. I've even found letters in the asylum records where inmates complained of their letters being confiscated, and those letters in themselves were in turn confiscated and put into their files. And this is a moving letter from Francis B. He asked to be released in 1896. He was writing to the superintendent of asylums during this period. And remember, this was a period, the late from the mid to late 19th century until the second half of the 20th century. This was the period of large-scale institutionalization of people being mad in places like Canada. And I realize it wasn't as large-scale institutionalization in all countries. For example, India, there was institutionalization of some mad people during this period, as has been written by a number of historians in some cases. But there was also a lot of people who would have been mad who were also in the community. So Foucault's argument that there was large-scale confinement of people has been very heavily critiqued as not being applicable to all countries and all societies. It's even in Western Europe, let alone globally in different parts of the South and North and northern parts of the world. For example, it's been very heavily criticized. But in Canada during this period, there was a large-scale confinement, and Francis was one of those people who were confined. There were very large numbers of institutions being created in North America during this period. And those people who were in charge of them were people like superintendents and inspectors of asylum. And Francis wrote this letter to the inspector of asylum because he was not getting anywhere with the superintendent. It would be the equivalent of, instead of writing to your mayor, you write to the governor of the region you're living in. So he went over the head of the superintendent to write to the person who was in charge of all asylums, in this case in Ontario. The head of the head of these asylums in all of Ontario, the inspector of asylums, in turn sent this letter back to the Toronto asylum, and where it ended up in his file. And I'll read it to you. It's dated September 18th, 1896, from Toronto Asylum. It has a stamp from the inspector of asylums, and he sent it back to the superintendent. It was never responded to. It says, "Your Honor, sir, I write you these few lines to ask if you would be kind enough to give my discharge, for I have been so long here. The judge only said for such time as I would get better. Mr. Noland and my uncle both came in and told me that I was free, only they could not take me out as I was under you." What he's saying, just for some context, Francis had been confined in the institution by this period for 19 years, since 1877, under what was called a lieutenant governor's warrant. And so he could not be released without an order in council of the province. He was confined for this period. He had absolutely no chance of being released. And I'm sorry to say his letter was never responded to. And tragically, 23 years after he wrote this letter in 1919, and 41 years after he was first admitted, Francis ended his life in the asylum. He had what was called parole of the grounds, and he walked out on the grounds and ended his life. So much of this history is very tragic. The man who wrote this letter never got any response. He was ignored, and he ended his life in despair, never being released as he had asked to be. And that's the history of many people who are confined in institutions during this period, of being ignored, of having their views not taken at all seriously by anyone because they were deemed mad. And that's one of the reasons why I felt it's so important to teach on this topic from the points of view of people who lived these experiences. Clifford Beers was one of those people who was listened to, mind you. Now, he was a very well-known author at this time. He was the first best-selling author in the United States whose book was written by someone who was public as having experienced madness. He never denied that he was mad, unlike some of the earlier authors I referred to rather. Clifford Beers specifically said he did experience madness. He was from an upper class family. He went to Yale University. You don't go to Yale University in the late 19th and early 20th centuries unless you're from a very rich family. And after he was released, he wrote a book called A Mind That Found Itself, very much denouncing the abuse that he endured and experienced, and founded the National Committee for Mental Hygiene in the United States. So he tried to advocate for a number of asylum inmates in different places during this period, but at the same time, he was pro-eugenics. And this was a period when eugenics was very popular amongst the upper and middle classes, saying that people with mental disabilities should be sterilized or at least confined for long periods of time to prevent people with mental disabilities from reproducing. And I'm sorry to say that Clifford Beers was one of those people who supported this. So we also have to acknowledge that many mad people while some were supported by other mad activists and other people with disabilities, others were not. And Clifford Beers was not in support of people whom he deemed to be mentally disabled and in need of and what he saw as being needing sterilization. So we have to be careful not to make mad people into mad people's history into the history of saints as all victims and not as any critical analysis. There were people who were activists or who spoke out publicly on issues that were very troubling, we would find nowadays, who did not support other disabled people during this period when they needed support. And there was also a lot of racism in the MAD community as well, as there is in all communities. And that needs to be very emphasized, of the need to criticize from within our own community and our own history. Otherwise, it becomes a sort of hagiography of our past. There was also, of course, her most horrific example. Clifford Beers was in the United States. He was an American. And I mentioned he was pro-eugenics. There was about 60,000 people with disabilities who were sterilized in the United States from the early 1900s to the late 1960s, compulsorily sterilized. And there was several thousand in Canada as well during this period. But the worst example of course, the atrocities committed towards people deemed mad and people deemed intellectually disabled were under the Nazis, who were believed, who promoted the idea that mad people were a burden. This is a stereotyped and very racist image from Nazi Germany in the 1930s, taken from Michael Burley's book, Death and Deliverance. And it shows an image of a supposedly quote unquote healthy Aryan, quote unquote, shouldering mentally disabled people, one of whom is racialized with darker skin. And of course, the devaluing of the life of disabled people in Nazi Germany led to the mass murder of disabled people, as you can see in this graph, with fictional statistics claiming that mentally disabled people would outnumber people who were not mentally disabled within a period of time unless they were sterilized. And eventually up to, as we know, about 400,000 people with disabilities were sterilized in Nazi Germany, and between 200,000 and 300,000 people under Nazi rule were murdered during the Second World War in different parts of Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe. And so that was the worst example of the persecution of mad people and intellectually disabled people in our history. So this was also a period after World War II when more and more people began realizing that the rights of people who were experiencing madness needed to be protected and acknowledged more seriously than had been done before, partly out of the horror of what had happened in Nazi Germany, but also recognition that there were abuses happening closer to home, not as horrific as happened in Nazi Germany. There were not mass murders of mad people on a scale that happened in Nazi Germany anywhere else, thank God. But there were terrible atrocities. Nevertheless, there were terrible abuses that happened in institutions in different parts of the world. And one of the first groups that advocated was this group in one of the first groups in the United States is this group in Rockland State Hospital in New York called We're Not Alone. And there were other people who were writing about their experiences, such as Mary Jane Ward. Her book, in The Snake Pit, which was made into a very well-known movie in 1948, was very much of an expose of the abuse of mad people in institutions in the United States during this period. There were other sources as well. There was different other books that were published during this period about experiences. This is a book by Red Jordan Arobato from the United States, who was denouncing electroshock. And of course, this was a period too, wasn't it, where what we now call ECT, or electric shock therapy, was developed first in 1938 in Italy by Serletti, and then it expanded in different parts of the world. It is very controversial to this day. Many people say it should definitely not be used. So it's a very highly controversial treatment. Its proponents say it has been changed over the years, but others would argue that it still has a terrible impact on people's capacity to remember, and has been often inappropriately used. There were other sorts of dubious treatments at this time, and probably the most notorious being lobotomy. Lobotomy was first used in Portugal by Igasmanes in 1935-36, and spread to different parts of the world, including here in Canada as well as in the United States, in which the frontal lobes were removed, or part of the frontal lobes were removed under the completely misguided idea that it would cure mental illness, and it did no such thing. It devastated people's lives and caused enormous suffering, and was certainly one of the most discreditable treatments used by people, by doctors on psychiatric patients during the mid-20th century in particular. There are other examples as well of patient writings during this period. So this is now that we're getting into the latter part of the 20th century. By the 1960s and 70s, the exposés of abuses in institutions that were made in different parts of the world, and the increasing efforts to promote civil rights of marginalized groups in different places and different areas around, obviously, African-American and African-Canadian civil rights, Indigenous people civil rights, gay and lesbian civil rights, the rights of other various marginalized groups became more and more prominent during this period. And amongst those who were active at the same time were people who were also in psychiatric institutions, when there was an increasing move to deinstitutionalize large-scale asylums, both for people with intellectual disabilities and for people with psychiatric disabilities. And this took off in the 1970s, especially 1960s and 1970s, and well into the late 20th century. And so there were larger numbers of ex-patients who were discharged out into the community than had taken place than ever before. It was also a period of the rise in psychopharmacological treatments during this period, with larger numbers of people getting psychoactive medications. These were used as an argument that stated that people could be discharged out into the community and not being kept into institutions. It's hugely controversial. Many people have argued that the closure of institutions was done to save the state money, and lack of support for people, especially poor psychiatric patients who are on the margins, was a great failure of the institutionalizations. Others have criticized it as pointing out that it was not so much deinstitutionalization as trans-institutionalization, where large numbers of people were transferred from large-scale institutions like psychiatric hospitals, some of which I've shown you pictures of before, where thousands of inmates were kept, to smaller scale group homes or boarding homes that were in some cases poorly run, and where there was still a high degree of surveillance of people in ratio of inmates, residents to staff. So it's a highly contested issue, and it's still ongoing now. It's not over. This is not a history that's over. It's a process that's continuing now in different parts of the world, where large numbers of people who would previously have been confined for a long period in institutions have been released. And I have to, if I acknowledge my own experiences, I was a psychiatric patient in the 1970s, myself having been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and as a 14-year-old, and then as well as a 16-year-old. And I was confined for a total of 6 months, and I was lucky. That was relatively short. It seemed long to me, but I recognized compared to many people I knew and many others I've read about, it was a very short period of time. But that was largely because of deinstitutionalization, and thanks to the fact that I had a very supportive and loving family, especially my mother and father. Many people who did not have a supported, loving family like I did were confined for longer periods of time, or had a far more difficult period, ended up in much more difficult economic straits, were living in boarding houses or on the street. And much more socially marginalized. So that needs to be very much emphasized, as depending whether or not you had support in the community or not was really a happenstance. It was basically, if you were lucky enough to have that sort of support, you were able to live out in the community. This publication I'm showing you here, it's been on the screen for a few minutes so I could get all of this background, was perhaps one of the most well-known publications during this time of large-scale deinstitutionalization. It was published in San Francisco in the United States from 72 to 86, Madness Network News, and published by a group of ex-psychiatric patients talking about what their experiences were like and advocating for the rights of people, either in the institutions or out in the community, and it was very important. There are other sorts of groups during this period as well that were published. This is a group called the Not So Patient Voice, which is kind of a play on words, from Athens, Ohio, 1978. Those of us who are of a certain age could recognize this sort of type. It's not photocopy, it's Gestetner machine, and it's those were very common for grassroots groups in this period, which were producing their own pamphlets or leaflets or newsletters, as was this one. There is also this group called Prompt, which was the protection of the rights of mental patients in therapy, was a group in London, England in 1979 that published their own newsletter. So this was a period when more and more newsletters were being published. And it's also important to emphasize this was a period where the accounts of people who were had been in institutions were much more representative than the earlier group of patients I talked about, who tended to be from the upper and middle class and were pretty well exclusively white. There was more writings by people who were working class, for example, from the 1970s on. Many more women left their writing accounts. There were some examples of women writing accounts from the earlier parts of this history, but generally speaking, tended to be more male patients up to the 19th century. But now there were far more women writing their accounts of their experiences, and more people of different racialized backgrounds as well, although it did still tend to be largely white ex-patients who wrote their accounts, but there were more broader representation certainly from a class point of view of perspectives being promoted. And that was, of course, largely because there was more access to writing material and there was more mass literacy, of course, including amongst the working class. By this period, there was we'd had a century of universal literacy programs in many of the countries that are being represented here. Amelie was from Denmark, which was published in 1981, is another example of a publication. There was also publications in Brazil. This is a Portuguese publication by ex-patients. I should acknowledge that the person who collected this material was a man named Alan Markman in New York City, and he very generously donated a number of these these publications to an archives I was involved with earlier early 2000s. And Alan was one of the first people to collect a lot of these documents, and he also could speak and read Portuguese, so he had contacts with different people in different parts of the world, including in Brazil. And it's important to emphasize that while a lot of the groups I'm talking about here are from the global north, and pretty well most of them are from Canada and the United States and Western Europe, there were also groups involved in this activism outside of North America and Western Europe, such as in Brazil and elsewhere. And so we really need to emphasize there were people in the disability rights movement generally, and in different efforts to promote the rights of people who are experiencing madness in different parts of the world in the global south. That needs to be very much emphasized. It's very important to acknowledge and to get this history recorded, because there's often been a sort of arrogant promotion by people in the global north that most of the activism has happened only here, and that's not true. And a number of scholars have been pointing this out, especially in the disability rights movement more generally. There's been lots of activism elsewhere in different parts of the world outside of the Western world. And this is one example in Sao Paulo, Brazil, 1983. There's, as I mentioned, more women writing their accounts, and this is perhaps one of the more well-known counts in Canada, 1975, I'm not mad, I'm angry, women look at psychiatry. So more women were writing their accounts of their experiences at this time. And one of those was woman was Margaret Gibson. She wrote her book on the butterfly ward, which she was one of the first ex-patients to write publicly during this period and have her book become a bestseller and getting all sorts of awards. She died about 15 years ago. But that's important to emphasize that more people were becoming public about their experiences as having been psychiatric patients during this time than had been the case before, because as we know to this day, the huge stigma and discrimination towards people with a psychiatric history. And in a number of many cases, of course, people have very legitimate concerns about being public as ex-patients or current patients because of fear of being killed by the police. There are many examples, especially of racialized members of our communities being restrained and killed by the police because of the police stereotypes about people being mad and having a psychiatric history. In Toronto, there's been a lot of different examples of African Canadians and Asian Canadians who have been killed by the police over the last several decades, who were in psychiatric distress or mental health distress, and were responded to by the police with brutal force, in a number of cases having shot them to death and killed them. And so there's been lots of protests around these police killings of people with mental health disabilities, particularly the racist nature of these killings that have happened. So that needs to be emphasized as well, that this is certainly not something that has, it's not something that all people feel comfortable being public as psychiatric patients, because a number of people who are, for example, Indigenous or African Canadian, for example, will point out it's safer for white people to be public as current or former patients or as just claiming the term mad than it is for many people who in racialized communities who have much more concern about fear of being restrained and even killed by the police than do white people. So it's a lot of important distinctions in that regard that need to be emphasized. This was the first group in Vancouver, and which was the Mental Patients Association. So again, their publication was called In a Nutshell in 1976, and so a lot of these early groups were trying to promote the rights of patients in the community. This is Ontario Mental Patients Association from 1978. Civil Rights for Mental Patients was the name of this particular document, published in 1978. And there are different community groups that were established during this period as well, that were public. This was a group called On Our Own, which takes its name from a well-known publication by Judy Chamberlain in the United States from 1978. It was a group that, it was a community activist group in the 1980s and 1990s that had a community center where different people from the who are experiencing madness or psychiatric disabilities, however one's chose to self-identify, who could come and feel that they were able to be get some support, or at least have some social connections. There was also protests, of course, during this period. Aldo Alviani, there's also examples of people who died in institutions and were overdrugged. The young man here, Aldo Alviani, whose picture is in the bottom of the page, was overdrugged at a local hospital here in Toronto, what was then called the Queen Street Mental Health Center. And so there was a protest against his death. And this led to the creation of the PPAO, which stands for the Psychiatric Patients Advocacy Organization Office, Psychiatric Patients Advocacy Office of Ontario, which was set up in response to inquiries into abuse of psychiatric patients at this period, during this period in Ontario. And so there are different advocacy organizations that were promoted. Phoenix Rising is another well-known publication written by ex-psychiatric patients during this period. You'll notice the byline says the outspoken voice of psychiatric inmates. Of course, the terms that people used were very changeable. The mental patients was used in some of the early groups. Others called themselves psychiatric inmates. Others used the term psychiatric survivors. Others say MAD. Others would identified as mentally ill. Others called as consumers. So the terms were constantly changing, and they are evolving to this day. There will be never one single term that everyone will agree on. But I think one thing we will agree on is everybody deserves to be called by their own name, no matter what choice they have in terms of what term they're called, they choose to identify with. So that's very important. This is a publication also about the experiences of people who lived in boarding homes in Toronto during this period in 1980 called The Cuckoo's Nest. And La Coyote was a publication from Quebec City, 1985. Still seeing a poster on the pathologization of people because of their sexual orientation by Persimmon Gilhooly, Persimmon Blackbridge and Sheila Gilhooly from 1985, who were pathologized as for being lesbian. And the different organizations that were sprouting up in different places in the world: Psychiatric Survivor Alliance in Ontario, Consumer Survivor Information Resource Center, just to give you an idea of the large number of groups that were established at this time. Pat Capone's book, Upstairs in the Crazy House, very much talked about her experiences as a person with a psychiatric history who was in a boarding home and experiencing a lot of poverty and distress during that period. And she ended up becoming a well-known advocate for people here in Toronto up until her death 2 years ago. And so there are other different publications. I'll call them a crazy story from the MAD movement. Again, the very term crazy, a lot of people don't like that term. Others say it's a way of reclaiming language. So it depends where you're coming from. Different people would have different takes on it. And there was also efforts to promote Psychiatric Survivor Pride Day, or it was later called Mad Pride, in different places in the world during this period. So I'm going to end by just concluding this is what happens when our history and our rights are forgotten. This looks like just a regular bus stop here. You say, well, what's the big deal? Well, what the big deal is that this is a burial ground for over 1,511 people who were forgotten for a long period of time, and 154 of those people had grave markers, many of which were covered by earth until 2005, and 1,357 people who buried there had no grave marker whatsoever. You can see this picture. I took these pictures in March of 2005, and you can see the graves here were largely forgotten. this particular one had a grave marker, but it was filled with ice and water, and was very poorly maintained. So there was this grave literally had fallen in. It was the grave of Florence R. I didn't know whose grave it was at the time, but a few months later, when some of us went to clean up the graveyard, we found who this person was whose grave had fallen in. And so we had an effort to restore this particular grave, and we literally dug the markers out of the ground at this period. And the man in the red shirt in the background is the one who led much of this effort. His name Ed Chaniszewski, where people were literally trying to try to remember those who died and who were forgotten for so many decades. These photos were taken by my friend Graham Bach, who's shown in this picture here. Graham died last year, so I'd like to thank Graham for all of his many years of work in the community, and including taking these pictures. But it gives you an idea of how people were just forgotten. This person's grave was buried under the earth, and when the earth was dug up, 1959 was embedded right into the ground. Shows how long they were buried. So there were people who continued to be in anonymous graves, but has now been publicly acknowledged with a marker, and it took a long time for that to happen, thanks to efforts by people like Januszewski and other people in the community. But ultimately, the point I'm trying to make here is that when people are forgotten in life, they're often forgotten in death. And so there's been an effort to restore the cemeteries and graves of people who were buried in a lot of different asylums in different parts of the world, whose graves were left to literally rot and to deteriorate, and an effort to try to show some dignity to people who were forgotten during their own lifetime. So I'd like to conclude now. I see it's 10 o'clock, so I guess it's time to conclude my talk at this point and take a break. So thank you very much, and I'll be glad to answer any questions when we come back.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey, for a really long durée sort of overview on histories of people who've been called and considered mad. And I given sort of, that we have a couple of minutes, so please do put in your questions in the Q&A box. In the meanwhile, I'll get us started by asking you one question. Given sort of, the long-term perspective you have on this archive, so to speak, how has the idea of mad, in a sense, been constituted and reconstituted? So who was called mad in the very early sort of times, and who is, so in a sense, who's called mad now, and what is that journey? What is the relationship between what was mad then and what is mad now?
Yes, that's a good point. Well, many people called mad. I didn't mention there were people called mad who were also believed to have had divine madness. Madness brought by, there was the supernatural madness of madness being brought by devils, and her supernatural force of a negative kind.
Yeah.
Bad karma, I guess, is one term as well that has been used by different people as well. But there's also good karma, or good spiritual belief. Good divine madness was believed to have brought by a god, or a supernatural, or a god, by supernatural beings visited upon people who had divine inspiration. And there is a history of that sort of madness. In fact, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, there are mad people who are believed to be saints. And who are made into saints in different parts of the world. So there are those who believe that madness can be viewed as positive in certain respects, but there's no question that the negative views of madness are far more predominant. And so people who tended to be considered mad were those who were considered speaking in ways that were not clearly understood by others, that were different cultural perceptions, perspectives. People who are experiencing what we would also see as now we would now call as depression, psychological despair, or people who endured trauma. People, for example, women who were severely abused in the home or sexually abused, who endured trauma, were often accused of madness, and they were experiencing madness for good reason, because they had suffered terrible abuse. So, and also postpartum, what we now call postpartum depression as well, for example, after women who gave birth and had depression. So there are different examples of experiences of madness that people had at different times, but that have been reconfigured and re-understood. Today, of course, what experiences of madness are in the last 130 years, it's been much more biologically oriented, very much so, and in different parts of the world, beginning in Europe and especially in North America after the mid 20th century, but even before then, much more focus on biology of madness as being due to chemical imbalances in the brain, for example. That's been very highly criticized and contested, of course. So so that needs to be emphasized as different interpretations of what is and what isn't madness.
Yep, because when one thinks of, for example, a figure that shows up often in old theater or even old novels is the village idiot, right? Like who served a purpose, who served a social function, and who, which ranged from sort of entertainment to many other things. And it's at what point that figure becomes vilified is also something that's quite interesting. And I mean, it is, of course, an incredibly rich history, both sort of socially, institutionally, and culturally. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this morning for you and evening for us. It has been a pleasure listening to you. And for, our those of you who've enjoyed the lecture and would like to share it with, colleagues and friends, that our lectures are uploaded to the YouTube channel. So please do go and have a look at it there. Do consider joining us for the next lecture on hysteria, which is on Sunday by the psychiatrist Sanjeev Jain, who speaks about the complex and convoluted persistence of an idea. And I think you will see resonances and hear ideas that have already been shared today by Geoffrey. Do explore the exhibit, The Asylum, which has been put together by Alok Sareen, Pratima Murthy, and Sanjeev Jain. And of course, do give us your feedback and, stay in touch, and do continue to come for our programs, which continue until the middle of May. So thank you again, Geoffrey, and a good evening to everyone.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for taking so long. I realized I should have ended a bit earlier. So
it was interesting. It was interesting, and I think we took a lot to think about. So I think it will resonate. Given the public lecture series, things come back. So it's been most interesting. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be back in half an hour then.
Yes.